Well, previously I put together a video entitled TFL Shutdown. It was essentially a semi-glib, sardonic dismissal of some of the essential claims of the people who are asserting to be living true force loneliness. It wasn't really particularly thought out, kind of off the cuff, sort of intended to be semi-humorous, kind of biting. At this point, though, I think that I would like to make a video that's a little more focused and a little more honest in terms of directing someone to an alternative to embracing the true force loneliness mentality. Now, in my previous video, for one thing, I made a certain statement, which I said that our arguments were only really valid assuming that true force loneliness really exists. So in other words, I sort of displayed a degree of hesitation regarding accepting the idea even of the very existence of true force loneliness. Now, I'd like to clarify this a little bit. From my life experience and from what I see around me, I think that it is very obvious that our world is moving in a direction of excessive commercialism, and I think that it's natural that people are going to be very impressionistic in the wake of all of this that surrounds them. This multimedia, these multimedia messages that they're always bombarded with on TV and whatnot. So I don't deny that a large percentage of not only women but men as well have ingrained within them these very superficial, materialistic, image-based standards, particularly when it comes to seeking out a mate. What I do, however, have a problem with is one, entitling this idea true force loneliness, and two, succumbing to some of the solipsistic implications of this title. I have absolutely no problem with, and I even recommend guys getting together, guys who are experiencing the same dilemmas, getting together if they're going to productively help each other heal, help each other grow as human beings. However, I think that there's naturally something very dangerous in assuming that loneliness is being forced on you. Now, whether it's true, I'm not making any claim as to whether it's true or not, whether it's true that loneliness can be forced on another individual. I'm not saying one way or another. But I do think that it's an essentially dangerous idea that carries with it very damaging implications. Now, something else that I do think has to be addressed and questioned is that when you are examining these people who claim to be living this life of true force loneliness, one question that you have to ask yourself is, well, is there anything other than their appearance that might essentially prove to be a turnoff to women? In other words, is it very possible that there's a certain degree of responsibility that they should be harnessing that they're refusing to harness? Now, I'm not saying that that's true in all cases, but I do think that it is a worthwhile idea to bring up because I think that it's at least true in some cases. Now, building on this, I think that one of the essential dangers of the true force loneliness mentality is that it essentially serves to perpetually reinforce a feeling of victimization. Now, I think that the essential danger of subscribing to such a mentality that perpetuates feelings of victimization is that it's going to have a snowball effect, further embittering you, and the more and more you become embittered, the less and less conducive I think that your mindset will be to find a mate, to find someone with whom you can really interrelate, because you are essentially damaging yourself by wallowing in self-pity. I do think that there is something very true about that. Now, I would also like to emphasize at this point that I'm not saying that all of your claims are invalid regarding the nature of loneliness being forced. I sort of alluded to that a little earlier, but I'd like to emphasize that. So this isn't an attempt to throw blame in any one direction. What it is an attempt to do is to reach a more honest conclusion, a way to more honestly, productively deal with these feelings of isolation. A way in which perhaps guys who are experiencing the same thing can interact with one another in a fashion that doesn't serve to reinforce their pain, their problems. Now, this is going to sound like essentially a very glib, trite recommendation that I'm sure you've heard it over and over and over again, but I honestly think that a good alternative to subscribing to this mentality is simply to find something that you enjoy doing and focus your energy in doing that. Granted, it's not going to necessarily completely dissipate your loneliness. You may very well experiencing it, but I think that there's a degree of wisdom that one reaches when they realize, hey, you know, I may be lonely, but it's not necessarily going to be this way forever. And even if it is, I mean, looking at it from the most bleak perspective, even if it is for the rest of my life, it's not the end of the world. There are essentially other factors in my life that are very positive that can offset this feeling of perpetual loneliness, and I don't need to feed into it. I don't need to reinforce it. In the words of a philosopher that I'm very fond of, Alan Watts, he says something to the effect of that negative emotions compound themselves when one reacts to a negative emotion with another negative emotion. So in other words, let's examine this whole notion of loneliness. We're alone, we dislike being alone, we subscribe to the TFL mentality, and essentially we train ourselves to truly hate being alone. So now we've compounded that feeling of loneliness with a hatred of loneliness. Now you might ask, well, wait a minute, how is it possible to not hate being lonely? It's a very uncomfortable state. Who should enjoy it? Well, nobody should. Is it possible to imagine being lonely without hating being lonely? In my opinion, yes it is. You don't need to compound that feeling of loneliness with other negative associations. You learn to deal with it in a more honest, direct way. And although that doesn't make being lonely any more pleasant, I do think that it sort of keeps you above the water and you don't necessarily succumb to that feeling of loneliness, particularly in a fashion that perpetuates that loneliness. So these are just a few thoughts that I'd like to throw out there. If anybody has any feedback for me, I'd be happy to hear it. Anyways, everybody out there, good luck dealing with your issues. Take care.